believe me, it's just absolutely, you know.
No question about it.
I'm trying to think when I saw you last, Joe. It's been a long time.
I was just thinking about the songs of innocence and of experience, Bill. That was not the last time I saw you. Probably the most time I ever spent with you was in County when you and Joan came.
You know, when I moved out here to Ann Arbor, I had my place on Christopher Street until 1996. I couldn't pay the taxes anymore, so I had to work out something else. So what I did was, Arnold Weinstein had for a while a place at Chelsea Hotel. They had an extra room. I'd use that. But then later we would go back and rent a room at the hotel for $100 a night. And it would be sort of denizens of the South, you know, for about 10 years or so. And then somebody had a very nice place in the Park Vendôme. It was very nice. Had a grand piano, and so I could rehearse there, and so on. This was very nice. But then, you know, over time, I am right now, yes, outside of the town a little bit. I have a place about a mile out of the town, and I have a nice big backyard, and just next to us is a big farm. But also, you know, it's a pleasant place. And Ann Arbor is a nice town. I know, but it is true. But that was a job, and I was able to finish the songs of innocence because of the time they gave me. Yeah. And then, of course, everything else happened. Joan's career started to blossom. Next thing you know, I was teaching middle of the week, Tuesday afternoon through Thursday morning. Here, we were off touring Thursday night and coming back on Mondays. And we did that for 40 years.
I saw Joan, I think, a moment ago, but she's left the room, I guess.
Well, she's there, she's downstairs, but I'm sure she'll come up and wave at you.
Hello. Joe, where are you? Are you in New York?
I'm on West 96th Street, Russell.
Oh, okay.
96th in Columbus, Upper West Side.
Yeah, good location.
I've been on the Upper West Side since 1975.
Wow. I never moved out there, but Arnold said, go down to the village because, I mean, you know, I had more friends that were writers and stuff. So I ended up being there on Christopher Street for 100 years. I kept that place till 1995, so I had it about 22 years. And then I had to give it up. And after that, I went to the Chelsea Hotel when we were in town. And so it was, it became sort of a desert there. That was kind of a wonderful place to be.
Carson, how are we doing? Carson, are you there?
He's muted.
Carson, you're muted. place Gershwin in the music of American history, and particularly right now at this specific time in American history. Then we'll be following with Russell Hartenberger. Russell was one of the original members of the Steve Reich musicians. And unfortunately, Steve could not be with us, but Russell probably knows as much or more than Steve does. So we'll be talking about Steve's music with Russell. And then we will finish with William Bolcom, who I will probably refer to as Bill because we've known each other for a lot of years and it's a little difficult for me to call him William, and he'd probably be upset anyway if I did. So that will be the plan. The way we're going to organize this afternoon is we'll have each person talk with me or present, depending on how they prefer and how talkative they are, for about 25 minutes. And then we'll finish with questions at the end, some Q&A. If you have questions as we go along, please feel free to write them in the Q&A, or I think that's what it is, the Q&A area, and I will be happy to go through them and bring them up to our presenters. So we're going to start with Joe Horowitz. Joe, so Gershwin, you feel is one of the most, if not the most important composer along with Ives, even more so than Aaron Copeland. So maybe that's at least a way to start, or you can deflect that question completely and start as you wish. But tell us a little bit about Gershwin and how you view him in the pantheon of American composers and the beginnings of American music.
Well, thank you for that question, Dan. One of my books is called Classical Music in America. And of course, it includes Gershwin. And I made a discovery that blew my mind when I was writing that book and writing the section on Gershwin, which is that I could hardly find an American-born classical musician of Gershwin's generation who had anything good to say about him. All the classical musicians of Gershwin's generation who greatly appreciated him seemed to have been European-born, whether they were residing in Europe or the United States. So if you're thinking about Gershwin admirers in the US, you have Arnold Schoenberg, you have Fritz Reiner, you have Jascha Heifetz, you have Otto Klemperer. But then you have American-born classical musicians, and I'm thinking especially of Aaron Copeland and Virgil Thompson, because they wrote the book, who view him as an inspired dilettante. So I wasn't prepared for this schism between two different views of Gershwin. I'll just share with you a few quotes. I wound up writing a book sort of about Gershwin. It's this book. It's called On My Way, The Untold Story of Ruben Mamoulian, George Gershwin, and Porgy and Bess. But here's just a few representative quotes. Copeland almost never wrote about Gershwin, but he was recorded talking about Gershwin at the New School in 1937. And he said, Mr. Gershwin's jazz, he was asked about Mr. Gershwin's jazz, and he said, Gershwin is serious up to a point. My idea was to intensify jazz, not what you get in the dance hall, but to use it cubistically to make it more exciting than ordinary jazz. And Olin Downs wrote an obituary for Gershwin in the New York Times. It's very odd reading today, in which he said he never passed a certain point as a serious composer. And Paul Rosenfeld, who in these years was sort of the best known writer on modern music in the US, called Gershwin a gifted composer of the lower unpretentious order. There is some question whether his vision permits him an association with the artists. And these extreme views, which seem extreme to us today, were actually representative during Gershwin's lifetime, unless you're looking at people like Otto Klemperer, born in Germany, who when asked about Copeland said, the guy who really interested me was Gershwin. And in later life, he was in the 30s when Gershwin died. He, as you may know, he orchestrated the second prelude, sort of in the style of Kurt Weill as a tribute to Gershwin. So I call this the Gershwin threat, and I've written about it a lot. And it seems to me very suggestive and fascinating that Gershwin was so threatening to American classical composers of his generation. And then the other theme that I belabor is I call it the Gershwin moment, which is to say the Gershwin threat is behind us. And we can now see Gershwin as a major American composer rather than as a gifted dilettante on the margins. And a good way to track that is to just track the fate of Rhapsody in Blue and American in Paris and what am I leaving out? The Concerto in F as performed on subscription by American orchestras. American orchestras ghettoized these pieces as Pops pieces until around the 1990s. The exception was the New York Philharmonic, which always played these pieces on subscription. But just to cite a few statistics, if you're talking about the Boston Symphony, Rhapsody in Blue was first played on a subscription concert by the Boston Symphony. Do you care to guess? Russell, Bill, would you like to guess when the Boston Symphony first gave Rhapsody in Blue as something other than a Pops piece?
1980.
1980 is your guess. Bill, do you have a guess?
That sounds about right. I don't know.
Okay, it's 1997.
Oh, wow.
How about an American in Paris, Boston Symphony on subscription, 2005? I have amassed a lot of statistics like that, and they all reflect the same fact, which is that we've finally accorded Gershwin belatedly the status that he enjoys. The other thing I'll mention, Dan, and then I'll shut up and you can ask me questions, is this book that I wrote about Porgy and Bess. I discovered the director Rouben Mamoulian writing another book called Artists in Exile. And I became aware that Mamoulian, who directed Oklahoma, who directed Carousel, whose films include Love Me Tonight, and who was the director of Porgy and Bess, was a very controversial and meddlesome figure. And I realized whatever he did to Porgy and Bess, it had to have been considerable. It's only relatively recently that the Mamoulian archive has been opened at the Library of Congress. And I went there looking to find a smoking gun and discovered the smoking gun almost instantly. And the smoking gun is the script, the final script for the play Porgy, which he directed in 1927, which is very different from all published scripts of Porgy. And what I discovered in a nutshell is that Mamoulian created.
Joe was talking about Gershwin.
What I discovered is that it was Mamoulian who created the character of Porgy. And it was Mamoulian who wrote the libretto for the end of the opera and who changed the ending of Porgy from what it had been as written by DuBose Hayward. So the Porgy we know is Mamoulian's creation. Once you realize that, it changes the complexion of the opera. If you have any knowledge of the novella Porgy that was written by DuBose Hayward. Hi, Joan.
Hey, Joe.
The Porgy ends with the character Porgy just sinking into oblivion. There's nothing heroic about the Porgy that was inherited by Mamoulian and Gershwin, and they replaced that character with another character. A character who's the moral compass of the community and who is a cripple made whole. The redemptive ending of Porgy and Bess is created by Mamoulian and Gershwin, which is to say, one of the things this opera is about is the saga of a cripple made whole. And this puts a different complexion on the eternal question about whether Porgy is a stereotype or if the opera is inhabited by stereotypes. In a nutshell, I would say that I think that this opera, probably there's been more nonsense written about this opera than just about any other classical music composition that I can think of. And that is why I wrote my book On My Way. And the clip, if we get to it, as Dan knows, is an interview with two distinguished African-American singers, George Shirley and Kevin Days, in which they're asked, do they think a white baritone could sing Porgy? And they both answer, of course, because they understand what Porgy and Bess is about. So there's an opening sally for you, Dan. What would you like to, where would you like to take it?
So let's cover a little bit from the very beginning, where you said that the classical world at the time, particularly the classical composers, considered Gershwin a real threat. What I found quite fascinating when I started researching for this festival was to see that Rhapsody in Blue was performed in February of, I think, is it 27? Does that sound right?
Something like that.
Something like that. And that Copeland got off the boat from Paris in June. So Rhapsody in Blue had been this marvelous success. And Copeland, of course, had a commission for the organ symphony or organ concerto to feature Boulanger and that with Kusevitsky at the BSO. So it doesn't surprise me, first of all, that there's a problem between the BSO and Gershwin, since their legacy is that of touting Copeland. But explain a little bit more the word threat. In other words, do you think they really felt that here was somebody who could usurp or stand in the way of the development of their careers and or, quote, the classical music scene in the United States, unquote? Or did they see him somewhat as just an interloper who is a flash in the pan and causing a slight disruption in how they figured the world was supposed to go?
So when you say they, I'm mainly thinking of the two guys who, as I said, wrote the book. The standard narrative, which we in our generation inherited about the history, the compositional history of American music, was literally written by Aaron Copeland and Virgil Thompson. These were books. Thompson wrote a book, Copeland wrote a book. And in both of these books, the narrative essentially begins with them. The idea is American music came of age, that's to say American classical music, after World War I, maybe say after 1920. And these guys who are modernists, they're essentially Oedipal, you know, they devour their parents. And they're very explicit that there's no music of consequence before, well, 1915 is the year that Thompson uses. So this writes off Ives. It writes off a lot of people who I have a high regard for, but Ives is the most prominent of those. And in these books, there's a compositional aesthetic that I would say is Francophile and modernist. So they have a very clear picture of Gershwin as somebody who's not a finished composer. That's what they say, that's what they feel, that's what they think. And from their perspective, it's easy to say that about Rhapsody in Blue. It's much harder to say that about American in Paris. It seems to me like a pretty well put together piece. Mm-hmm. But that's the starting point, at least on the surface. Gershwin is not aesthetically kindred to them. So when I say it's a threat, that's an inference. That in addition to finding that Gershwin was not aesthetically kindred, it was unsettling to them that he was so rich, that he was so famous, and he writes a concerto, and it's pretty good, and he writes an opera, and it's pretty good, and it has legs. So, and then if you juxtapose that, Dan, with Arnold Schoenberg saying, in one word, he's a great composer. Schoenberg was saying that first because Gershwin was a personal friend of his who he did regard as a great composer, but he also was saying that because he knew that Gershwin was not considered a great composer by American composers who were native born. And once you have a chorus of opinion, Klemperer, Loeffler, Reiner, all the guys, Shostakovich, abroad, people of real consequence calling Gershwin a great composer, and Thompson and Copeland denying that, you've got to scratch your head pretty hard.
Now, of course, composers are known to be completely without ego.
Oh, yeah, of course. Oh, yes, totally.
So there was certainly none of that in this, that they simply said, look, we're better than this guy and we want you listening to our music. Did they lighten up at all after his death? After his death?
At the end of his life, when he became a conductor, conducted Gershwin. And he changed his mind completely about Ives. Thompson, I think, was a harder case. I'm not aware that he ever warmed up to Gershwin, and he wrote very patronizingly about Porgy and Bess in particular, without denying.
Because his own opera did not do well, don't forget. You know, his Four Saints and Three Act didn't get any great press, and he was very angry because Porgy did.
Well, there you are. There's one view from Bill that he was pissed off that the other guy got a better reception and was more famous. So
he wasn't a conservatory product, and he didn't study with Boulanger. I mean, so he didn't have the credentials.
That's right. The whole story of American music, as I see it, is very hung up on credentials. That's why there's also a jazz threat. There's a Gershwin threat, and there's also a jazz threat, both of which we can now put in the past. But we're all old enough to know that that actually happened, and it mattered.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, Bill is a perfect example of what I'm talking about. You studied with Milhaud. Milhaud didn't have a problem with jazz. I'm sure Milhaud did not have a problem with Gershwin.
I don't think we ever discussed Gershwin.
He was from France, so the French didn't have these problems. The Americans did.
Yeah. Joe, let's end this segment on Gershwin, just bringing us up to date, where you think we are now in 2020 with questions vis-a-vis, so who can actually sing Porgy and Bess?
Okay, well, first of all, we're at a place where Gershwin can be studied by scholars. We're old enough to know that there was a time when scholars wouldn't touch Gershwin because he wasn't considered a serious composer. Now you've got Mark Clegg at the University of Michigan, heading a Gershwin Institute that's got, what's it called, the Gershwin Project, maybe? That's creating a new critical edition. The idea of a critical edition of Gershwin would have made no sense in the 1930s. As far as whether you can have a black singer sing Porgy, we're not nearly there.
A white singer.
Sorry, a white singer. That's another can of worms.
Well, in Europe, in the last few years, there was some all-white cast Porgy and Bess, was it? In
Budapest.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, but that's always been possible in Eastern Europe and Russia. It's in the United States where it's not been possible. The starting point for the clip, if we see it later, is Lawrence Tibbett singing Porgy. Do you guys realize that the first baritone to be recorded in the role of Porgy in 1935 was not Todd Duncan, who sang Porgy on Broadway, but Lawrence Tibbett, arguably the greatest baritone, operatic baritone ever produced in the U.S. Bill, do you know Tibbett's recordings of Porgy songs?
That all the time. I mean, on the Met broadcast out there in Seattle. No, good heavens, I certainly was very aware of Tibbett, and I think he was going to be the Porgy had the Met done it. And of course, Gershwin said, no, I have to have a black cast, and the Met would not do that.
So Tibbett always wanted to sing Porgy. If we get to the clips, if you've never heard it, hearing him sing "Oh Bess, oh Where's My Bess,"
Oh my gosh.
that's the best. That's the best recording I would say ever made of that song, and Tibbett happens to have been white.
Just the question: if we don't get to it, can people find these clips right on?
Yeah, go to YouTube, type in Tibbett, "Oh Bess, oh Where's My Bess." He recorded all the songs, even the ones that Porgy does not sing.
Beautiful.
And,
okay. Are there any? If anybody has any questions, feel free to type them in on chat or on Q&A. I'll be happy to bring your question to any of our.
Maybe I should mention the film before I shut up, which is
yes, please go ahead. Go ahead.
Dan mentioned, which he was kind enough to stream last night, is produced by me in my capacity as executive producer of Post Classical Ensemble, which is a chamber orchestra that I've run in DC since 2003. And it's an offshoot of a festival we called the Russian Gershwin, which took these themes of the Gershwin thread and the Gershwin moment and looked at how Gershwin has never been a threat in Russia, that the Russians have always had a love affair with Gershwin, and all our soloists were Russian.
Mm-hmm. And it's wonderful to watch that film also, because it has a complete performance of Rhapsody in Blue, a wonderful performance, and with a lot of by a pianist. What's his name, Joe? Remind me.
Gennady Zagor, a Russian pianist whose father was a guitarist, interpolates quite a bit of improvisation. And I actually find it maybe the most satisfying performance I've ever heard of Rhapsody.
Really? Interesting. Okay, Russell, you are here. We're going to talk a little bit about Steve Reich and his music. I'm going to make a couple of preparatory comments, and then we'll schmooze a little bit about Steve. So Gershwin, even though he's called Joe's film is called The Russian Gershwin, let's just remember that he was born at the very tail end of the 19th century, not in Russia, but in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. A good Jewish composer. He wasn't supposed to end up being a pianist. His parents bought the piano for Ira, and guess what? George sat down and played a piece that he'd heard once or twice, and they said, "Oh, it sounds like George has a talent maybe for the piano." And that's George ends up playing the piano. We move forward about 30 years later, or give or take a little more, and Steve Reich is born of Jewish parents, a lawyer and a songwriter. And the mother's songwriter takes off and heads off to LA. And Steve grows up in New York and ends up going to a Schmendrick little school named Cornell, where he studies philosophy, becomes enamored of Wittgenstein, as I remember. And then decides, though, to go into music, and ends up at Juilliard, and then goes out to the West Coast, where he was preceded to California, where he's preceded by Bill Bolcom. And they both ended up at Mills College studying with Darius Milhaud. Now, Bill, I just have to ask you a question. I assume Berio was not there when you were there, correct?
Not at that point, no. I only know him later, but I don't think that we were just talking about that Milhaud actually taught this other person you were just mentioning.
To Steve Reich, really?
I don't think they ever worked together, no.
Oh, okay. So it's listed in his bio and amongst some of the materials that I've read that he actually studied with Darius and then studied with Berio. That Berio came a little later.
I think Berio was the main one that I've heard him talk about.
Berio was the main. Okay, so the main teacher, Berio.
When he was in France, but I don't think so, because I would have known about it.
You would have. Okay, then I take that back. I stand corrected, which is wonderful.
Well, but it's one of those things that more biographies, when I was involved with which just picked up, actually everything was there, just without taking any much care about whether it was, verifiable or not. And no, that's one of those things that probably was like that. I don't think Milhaud ever worked with him, no.
Okay, so let's just say that you both studied at Mills College in California.
At different times.
At different times, exactly. Which is to say also, we'll come back to you, Bill, more on this, but that Reich went out to the West Coast, as John Adams later did, from a very, either New York or in John Adams' case, a New England upbringing, to experience the freedom and flexibility of the West Coast. And Steve ended up playing in the first performance of In C. Is that correct, Russell?
That's right.
I'm right on that. The seminal,
You're right on that.
The seminal minimalist piece of the late 60s, which involves considerable improvisation is the wrong word, but a loosening of the way materials are presented by the performers. And
that's right. And if I can just add.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead. maybe you were going to say the same
I
thing,
was
but
just going to say that legend has it that Steve added the high repetitive
right.
C's in the piano.
Ding, 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 ding,
yeah,
ding.
yeah.
That's very interesting.
This
Very bad production of that same piece without the ding, 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 ding. They did it at the music festival in France, and it was a mess. That ding, ding, ding holds the thing together very well. How many
well,
people are in our listening audiences who have not played in a production of in C? Raise your hands. I think most of us have. I certainly did. Yeah.
Sure.
the story Steve told to me, and I think it's in the book in C. I think it's Robert Carl that wrote that book. Is that the rehearsals weren't going very well for in C, and Steve, of course, who has some training as a drummer, percussionist, suggested that Terry Riley add a pulse. And so that's how the two C's, and I guess it was Steve Reich's girlfriend at the time, Jeannie Breschen, that actually played the top C's on the
Well, I
the
can tell you
piano
about it. It's
to
a
keep
mess.
it together.
Yeah.
So Russell, when did you first come across Steve and start working with him?
Okay, so after California, Steve moved to New York City. Maybe you mentioned that, and he started writing his phase pieces. 1965, he wrote "It's Gonna Rain," and then 1966, "Come Out," where he kind of developed this phasing process of one, two voices starting at the same time, or two melodies starting at the same time, and one moving a little bit faster to create a kind of a composite rhythm. And then he wrote a piece called "Piano Phase," which I think is being performed in the festival. Two
Indeed.
pianists doing the same process of phasing through three different sections. And then he went to Africa in the summer of 1970. He developed an interest in West African drumming and wanted to go to Africa to study there. So he got a grant to go in the summer of 1970, studied with a musician in the Ewe ethnic group of southeastern Ghana. And when he came back, he decided to write a piece which eventually is called Drumming. So this was he began in September of 1970 writing this piece. And by early 1971, he'd come up with a version anyway of the bongo section, which is the first section of drumming for four people playing bongos. But Steve didn't know any percussionists. He himself was a drummer. He'd studied with Roland Koloff when he was a teenager in New York City. Roland Koloff eventually became the timpanist of the New York Philharmonic for many, many years. But at that time, Koloff was just a young freelancer in New York City. Steve studied with him for a while, but he didn't really keep up his percussion studies, turned into full philosophy and then composing. But Steve was writing a piece for drummers, but knew no drummers. So he had friends of his playing the percussion parts or the bongo parts to drumming at the beginning. One was Arthur Murphy, who was a pianist that Steve met at Juilliard when he was in graduate school. Arthur Murphy was actually a jazz pianist as well as a classical music composer, and was a friend of Bill Evans, and actually transcribed some of Bill Evans' piano improvisations. And he knew another pianist, classical pianist named Steve Chambers, and then a flute player that he met in California named John Gibson. Now, John Gibson was also in the premieres of NC, so he knew John, and John moved back to New York. So the first people that started playing drumming were two pianists, Steve Reich, and a wind player. So Steve had no percussionists, and I was at the time a graduate student at Wesleyan University in Middletown, Connecticut, just beginning my doctorate in world music. They had a relatively new program there, and I had just begun in September of 1970 studying West African drumming, South Indian, North Indian, and Indonesian gamelan. And I got very interested in West African drumming, but I wanted to go to Ghana to study some more, but I had no idea how to do it. So I happened to mention this to a friend of mine, a colleague, another student, grad student at Wesleyan named Richard Teitelbaum. who was a composer. And Richard was from New York City. He knew kind of the underground New York music scene. He knew Steve Reich. He knew Steve Reich had been to Ghana in the summer of '70. And he knew Steve Reich had begun writing a piece, but he didn't for percussion, but he didn't know any drummers. So Richard suggested that Steve and I get together and talk about Ghana, and Steve could tell me about his new piece. So that's what happened. We met in New York City. Steve told me of what inoculations to get to go to Ghana, who maybe a couple of names to look up when I got there. And he invited me to come to a rehearsal of this new piece he was writing. So I came to his loft, which was down in Soho, near Broadway and Canal Street. And so I came to the first rehearsal, and there were these 4 pairs of bongo drums set up, being played by 2 pianists, a flute player, and Steve. And they were doing this technique called phasing, which I'd never done before. So I tried it out, enjoyed the experience, and so decided to join the group. And so that was how I got to know Steve initially. And as the composition of drumming progressed, Steve realized he would need more people. So he called up the Manhattan School of Music, and the percussion teacher there was a man named Paul Price at the time. And Paul said, well, I have this percussion student who just graduated, just got his master's, named Jim Price, different spelling of the last name. And Jim Price was interested in contemporary music. So Steve invited Jim to come to his rehearsal. So Jim Price and I really were the first 2 real percussionists to play in the group. And then he brought on some various students and acquaintances of Jim's and mine to fill out the ensemble. But the interesting thing for me anyway about the rehearsal process for drumming was that Steve was writing the music as we were rehearsing it. So we would rehearse by Steve showing us, demonstrating the part to play. So he would play a pattern on the bongo drums or the next section, which are the marimbas, and we would play it until we memorized it and then tack it on to the part we'd learned the week before. Steve would record everything, and then during the week, he would compose the next part of the piece. We would come in the next, usually on a Tuesday night, at Steve's loft, and he would again demonstrate the parts to each of us that he composed, and we would learn it. And little by little, that's how the piece evolved through 4 sections. The first section was bongos, the second is marimba and glockenspiels, and then the grand finale of all those instruments at the same time. Now, there were also, in the marimba section, there were some singers. And they were singing what Steve calls resultant patterns, which are little snippets of the patterns, the composite or the fabric of the music that was being heard. Drumming is composed with just one rhythm. That's the only rhythm heard throughout an hour and 20 minutes, the whole piece. But the resultant patterns were fragments of that pattern. And the singers and Steve Reich developed those patterns in separate vocal rehearsals, and then would bring them to the full rehearsals for the group. The same thing happened. Yeah, go ahead.
So how much was he affected in 2 ways? One, so I think you said, yeah, he was a drummer. He played in rock bands and did some jazz early on as a kid. So like Gershwin, like Mr. Bolcom, kind of a crossover kind of cat. And then he amplifies everything as Philip Glass does. And how much did he take into consideration your comments at rehearsals? In other words, did you guys say, Steve, this really doesn't work? What if we try this? What I heard also, and you can tell me if this is true, I happen to have heard the first performance of Music for 18 Musicians up in that 2nd story loft, wherever the hell it was.
Yeah.
And, you know, one of the seminal moments for most people in that piece is when the bass clarinets chug along on a repeated note and they move into the microphone and away from the microphone. And it has this elemental quality of a a roaring train or something, and
Yep.
even John Adams stole from that in Shaker Loops, and he should put an asterisk in and say thanks Steve, but he didn't. So how much did you guys have as input into these pieces?
We had actually a fair amount in some of the pieces. A little bit in drumming. In drumming, I think it was in the resultant patterns that the performers had a lot of input. So the singers, for example, in the Murmur section would sing patterns that they thought were attractive, and Steve would either accept them or make other suggestions. Same thing with the piccolo and in the last section of the piece. So in terms of the resultant patterns in drumming, performers had a lot of, they contributed a lot. Now, music for 18 musicians was another story. There was again, we rehearsed the piece as he composed it, and we had a lot more input, I would say, a lot of suggestions, because he never really wrote a score to the piece. It wasn't until Mark
Right.
Mellitz came along and was able to write it out. Steve couldn't figure out how to write it out. We had just pieces of paper with little, a measure or two, and then said, look at the bass clarinet player for a cue and cue J, or listen to the vibraphone here. Just like little words about what to do. And everybody just had these fragments of paper and
Fragments.
kind of figured out what to go along. But we would say, Steve, it would work better now if the piano comes in first and I come in second, and then we go to the bass clarinet, that sort of thing.
I see. That's very cool.
So for music for 18 and for a piece like Six Pianos, there was a tremendous amount of performer input for that piece.
Got it. Now, Joe, I'm told that the clarinet smear in Rhapsody in Blue was suggested by one of the first clarinetists, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's true. Well, what we know about the Shakespeare plays was that they were in certain ways very much the same collaborative sort of way. So that much of the language in the plays came from the actors. So there was something of that same kind of collaborative atmosphere there.
Mm-hmm.
So I suppose maybe in many areas there has been that sort of thing. But this is really wonderful to find out that that's how Steve's piece was kind of put together.
Yeah.
Yeah, with Six Pianos, I have to me, it's an interesting story. Anyway, we started rehearsing the piece at the Baldwin Piano Studio across from Carnegie Hall at the time. And Steve had an idea to write for, well, he said his dream was to write for all the pianos in a piano studio, but we didn't start with all the pianos. But the original manuscript for Six Pianos was maybe 10 or 15 pianos, and that just wasn't working. Especially the phasing didn't work from sitting far apart. So he kept reducing and reducing until he got to 6 pianos, which ended up being played by 5 percussionists and 1 pianist. But again, Steve recorded everything in rehearsals. And at one point, there was a part where I was playing a piano and my pattern changed to a new pattern, but I made a mistake. I played it wrong. I didn't notice that I played it wrong, and Steve didn't notice I played it wrong until he got back into his loft during the week and listened to it. And he liked my mistake better than what he had written. So measure 11 in 6 pianos, I composed that.
We love those. We composers love those mistakes. Bill, how much does Joan change vocal lines that you write for her? Say, Bill, this isn't what you want. Let's do it like this. Joan,
could I sell it?
Yeah.
Bottom line, that's what it was. Could I do it? It's funny. We're putting together a new cabaret. What I'm going to do is the first song he wrote for me, The Office Girls Lament. I told him some stories when we first met. He rolled those into a kind of a song, and I'm doing one he wrote that he would never let me sing. It's one I loved. It was from the quote unquote unpopular songs. And he said, and they've stayed that way.
I see. Okay.
Sure.
That's very cool. Now, Russell, let me just tell you, I'm curious about something. I'll ask it. So I first heard Steve's music probably in the early 70s, just as things got going. I was finishing up at Hampshire College in 75. And I went down and I decided I was going to do a concert at the end of my 4 years. And I want to include, I wanted to do pieces, music for pieces of wood.
Right.
The four claves piece. So I went down to Steve's loft and we talked about it for an hour or so. And I have never seen a loft as meticulously clean as his. I mean, we're talking about lofts in New York City on the Lower East Side. I mean, you know, as painters and writers and, you know, garbage and his, I don't think there was a speck of dust. Is he simply that the meticulous nature of his music that allows for, well, and I don't say this pejoratively, there's absolutely no room for variation. There's no room for change of tempo unless it's controlled to the utmost. Would you say that that's simply part of the personality, which is utmost control and sort of clean lines in everything that he does?
One of the things that I find attractive about Steve's music is that we have a lot of freedom.
Okay.
For example, in drumming, the pacing is determined by the musicians entirely.
Meaning the number of repetitions that you can
yeah, the number of repetitions, how long you stay in a certain section. So the timing of the piece, I played it, I think the initial performances were about an hour and 20 minutes. These days, it's more like 50 or 55 minutes. But, you know, there can be, 30 to 35 minutes difference in the total length of the piece. And Steve has never once told musicians it should be one length or another. Mm-hmm. He's let us determine that whole thing. Kind of the same with music for 18 musicians. Right. There's a lot of freedom. The musicians determine a lot of the pacing and tempo. He's very seldom has he told us about tempo. When we're doing phasing pieces, he's never said do the phase longer or do the phase shorter. Mm-hmm. So I know a lot of people think it's very controlled, but I guess it's just this whole sense of process that seems like a controlled process. But within that, from a performer standpoint, there's a lot of freedom.
Got it. Cool.
Although he is a fairly meticulous person. I don't know, the first score to drumming, for example, is all Steve's manuscript. Very clear manuscript. So he does have that aspect to his personality.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Anything you'd like to add for us about the pieces we're going to hear, which are drumming, the first part 1, and piano phase?
Drumming part 1.
Works.
Yeah, drumming part 1 is for percussionists. It's become standard repertoire. We're 2021. It'll be 50 years old. So actually, the group I play in, Nexus, is getting together with another group, Soul Percussion, in New York, and we're putting together kind of a not a retrospective, but it's a website anyway that talks a lot about drumming from different perspectives. We're having interviews with a lot of the original performers, and then the second and third generations. There's been at least 3, maybe 4 generations of people that have played that piece now. So it's gone through different versions. Mm-hmm. And I think the version you guys are doing is with students at University of Arizona, if I'm not
correct. That's correct.
So it'll be interesting to see what their performance is like. That's maybe 3 generations away from the beginning.
Yeah.
Piano phase is one of his early pieces, 67.
Right.
And it's still one of the most difficult. It takes so much concentration and endurance. You have to focus 15 minutes. And I think it's being played on pianos.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, so Jim Price and I actually came up with the idea of playing it on marimbas.
Right.
We were on a tour in England and had a break from a recording session, and Jim and I were kind of fooling around with the patterns on marimba, and Steve heard us playing the piece on marimbas, and he said, "Why don't you guys just work that up? It sounds pretty good on marimba." So we did, and ended up playing it probably more on marimbas than it's been played on pianos.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Thank you. So if anybody has any questions about Steve Reich for Russell, please just sign in with him. Bill, I'm going to get to you are on the spot, my friends, and I'm going to ask you the big question. Here's the big question. So all three composers, but you, well, you in particular, maybe that's the wrong word, but something close to that, came up playing both classical and jazz, and you among all of these are the most eclectic in your view of music and musical language and what you do with it in your approach. Mm-hmm. So, but all three of you guys, you know, are crossover guys. You got one foot on one side of the tracks and one foot in the other. Steve doesn't do his music so much now, but he did early on. Explain a little bit about how that happened for you and how you viewed that. I mean, it was not so easy. It was not so easy back in the 60s and 70s when you did that. We don't have to dwell on that period, but just, so how did you get where you got?
Gosh, I don't know. One thing followed after another. I was always drawn to different things, and if they intrigued me, I incorporated them. I sort of wanted to be able to have a very rich possible fund of possible musical gesture that would be at my command. When I got to Europe in 1959 and working, of course, with Mio, but also at the Conservatoire, and I was doing some performance and so on. And this was, of course, a period of Boulez, Stockhausen, and Barrio, and the very strong dictatorship, I think, of certain people, particularly Boulez, because, you know, if you were not a 12-tone composer, you were not to be considered. That was the way he was. Never mind all of that, because in the end, I think he still was a great composer. He just had this need to be able to sort of, well, this was also, France has got a whole love of polemic. If you went down the Boulevard Saint-Michel, you would see all these little bouquinistes here and there with a biography of somebody who's been written, has been written by some friend of the person, saying this is the greatest composer or this is the greatest painter and all, and never mind about the other ones because it's my friend. But this is what you'd find there, and so there's always been kind of the need to make a big kind of a play for your own music, verbally or in writing or something like that. In other words, you have to sell yourself as a kind of a political point of view. At least it was true there in those years. I mean, I think. That's how it was, so that's really why I was. I never cottoned to that. I never was interested in the business of. I never felt the 12-tone was necessarily anything but a tool, and I still have even used it sometimes when I wanted to. But again, it was a question of I wanted to have the whole musical language with its infinite variety and size, and the fact that I could go anywhere I wanted to in it, and how to. But then, of course, it was a question of finding how do these different things link. So, if I wanted to say there was anything that was particular about my music, it was my interest is in how those things link. Simply because music is really the linkage of two tones. You know, one note all by itself doesn't necessarily mean anything. You can make it mean, but otherwise it's this plus that plus that plus that. And that's where the meaning in music is. So one can also do that with styles. We can do this with any number of things, as long as you find a really natural and real and viable and playable with a kind of connection that you can actually use. So I had not really walked into the Songs of Innocence with the idea of using everybody's style there ever was. I never thought that was the whole idea at all. But what I did look at the poems, and the poems would sing to me and say, this is what I want you to do with me. My favorite case was I came to the Shepherd, and all of a sudden I sort of wanted to be a country and western. I don't even like country and western except for Jimmy Rogers and like that. But for some reason, that sounded exactly right. That's the way I did it. But my old way of trying to deal with a change or a jump like that was try to reject it. Mozart was supposed to have said that an idea came to him, and he did what he could do to kick it out of his brain. And if it didn't kick out, then he'd use it. And so I had the same kind of thing. Well, that's what I was. I kept, I cannot do this. I can't do country. I don't. And yet it just would not go away. And so that's what I did. So I realized I had to deal with, all right, this is what this thing, all these different faces of Blake, because Blake is really, in a way, the same kind of poet that I turned out to be as a composer. There is very much the classical background, again, but not through school. which is what make them very similar to Gershwin. They were not conservatory or Oxford or anything like that. There was no kind of an institution behind those guys. They did it by their own. But with Blake, there is a terrific. He was an amazing reader. He taught himself Hebrew. He taught himself all kinds of things. He's all self-educated. But the whole point is that all of that was part of his arsenal, and I like that as a whole point of view. And so that's what happened. That's how I was, again, every struggle with the thing was, no, I can't be doing this. Oh yes, it won't go away. I guess I have to do it. And that's how it got done. I did not walk in to that piece knowing that's what was going to happen. That's what did happen. I was drawn to it.
Bill is talking about songs of experience on the book, the eponymous book by William Blake, which is a wonderful read and a wonderful, wonderful piece. So you might want to listen to it. Bill, I'm going to ask you some questions because I'm a little bit selfish and I figure, what the hell? So we're both from Seattle, and you arrived about 15 years or so before I did. What was it like growing up in Seattle in the 40s and 50s, as you did, studying piano? Now, I remember from my dad that, major artists would always include Seattle on their stops. They'd go to San Francisco and LA, but they'd also go up to Seattle. Did
Sure.
you hear great pianists, and who did you hear as you were growing up in Seattle?
One that really struck me, and I'll never forget it, was the time I went to hear Giesecke. That absolutely, here was this man. He was so red. I understand he had a lot of drinking problem, but he was ready. He looked like he'd been boiled, and a sort of a largish kind of man, and he sat down and played the most beautiful exquisite Debussy I had ever heard since. Anything close to that. So I was so fascinated by his restraint, though, the fact he never overdid anything, but he had such a wonderful sense of how each one of those things. Debussy was terrific. All the other things he did was but that was what the kind of pianist I would like to have been. I'd been really a pianist and a pianist. I never thought of myself as a career pianist, because then I would have to have done what you had to do. And that's what was the problem. In the 1940s, every program was pretty much the same. You would start with the Bach Prelude and Fugue. Then you'd do a set of Chopin preludes. Then you might do a sonata. And they would often end up with this dreadful piece called Islamé. I must have heard Islamé 20 times in those years. It was just, and it's just, it was ridiculous how little interest there was in any variety of repertoire. The classical music station, they played essentially all the big hits. You'd hear Beethoven's Fifth of the Other Day and the Chopin A-flat Polonaise and some. There was all those sort of things. There was not a very strong culture in interest in music so much. It was sort of like a kind of social grace for a lot of folks. But there was some very fine people at the University of Washington whom I studied with actually quite early in my life. At age of 8, I was working already with the head of the piano department. I studied with George Frederick Mackay, who had a certain name, not only just all the school music he's done, but other things. I worked with a man named John Verrill, who gave me a very solid training. He had been at the Royal Academy of Music, so I had all my everything from him that way. So, but there was really a kind of a group of people who were there. But the rest of the city, no, I can't say it was terribly interested in music. I'm not sure it is today.
Did you go to the symphony? Was there a symphony at that point?
Sure. It was a part-time orchestra in those days. It was actually the first person who really brought it in as a regular subscription orchestra was Milton Katims.
Right.
Yeah.
I grew up also in Milton Katims' time. Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
So how did you, when did you decide that you wanted to be a composer?
I never wanted to be a composer. As a little boy, I wanted to be a composer. I've never not wanted to do what I did. There was not even a moment of question of choosing something else. Nothing. I was going to compose. That's all there was to that. And I studied piano in order to be able to learn literature, and of course I was the bane of my teachers. Once I learned a piece, I lost interest. I wanted to hear the next piece. So I was always interested in composition from the very beginning, from a very small boy. My early was not Mozart, but I started about the age of 11. I started really sounding like myself. In fact, I really did put together a compilation of my early quartets from the age of 11 through 2021, which has been published. And but already I was beginning to sound like myself. Now, in retrospect, I can see that. But before that, it was baby stuff. But I was learning all the literature I possibly could, and I just was a sponge. I just globbled everything I could.
Were you studying orchestral scores also from a young age?
Oh, sure, everything. And I would go to the libraries and oralize. In fact, one of the things I don't think I would go wherever I was. I mean, I would spend even the Everett, the town I was, had been a kind of a socialist area kind of thing for many years, and they had a very good library. And I would go and study scores even in Everett, Washington, or if I had some free time. Every Thursday from the age of 11, I would go down from Everett, where we were living at that point, 30 miles down to the University of Washington, where I would have my piano lesson with Madame Jacobson, who had been trained at the Schola Cantorum, and then I would have my composition lesson with John Virgil. And I had some hours, and I would go to the library and page through things, and so I learned a lot of my scores simply by sitting in the language in a library and oralizing them. Because the recordings there weren't too many. There were certain things. My God, I'll never forget. When I was 8 years old, we bought a copy of The Rite of Spring, which I must have worn out, and with Stravinsky conducting. I think Gunther Schuller was playing first horn, I think, but that's it. But I mean, really, you had to go hunt. There was not a big interesting climate of interest in music at that point.
Right. Okay, so let me ask one other question, and that is that somewhere at the background of all three of these composers, which include you. So let's talk about the question of high and low. And anybody who else wants to chime in, feel free to do so. In your mind, is there any difference between and you just said you wrote a country western tune and you figured, what the hell? That's what the text demanded. It spoke to you. Exactly. So is there a difference though between most country western music and most classical, or jazz and gamelan and
I think
Indian ragas, etc.?
I'm interested in all those things, but I'm interested in certain people who've done them. I mean, there's been more that, for example, I love jazz violin, but the one who really interested me was Joe Venuti. And I got to sit in with him once. That was one of the great thrills of my life. Joan, too. We had gone to see him because Sergio Loco, I don't think I would tell you about him. Sergio was he and Itzhak Perlman and Pinchas Zuckerman came from Israel at the same time. And the other two, Pinchas and Itzhak, were more or less straightforward violin kind of, you played 20, maybe 100 Tchaikovskys that season, and so on, that kind of thing. But he was always interested in the odd things and arcane. He didn't care. He was interested in most kind of amazing kind of things. And so one of the things was getting to know him. And he suddenly, maybe the first classical musician I've ever heard of, violinist, who was really interested in Joe Venuti, and of course with it all the wonderful collection of the jazz violin tradition dating from 1920s, from lots of fantastic people, but particularly Joe. And that was something I always thought it's either good or it's not good. I never believed in the high and low thing. I never could even stomach the notion. That was simply some kind of way of making people feel inferior if they didn't like something. So I'd rather have them be attracted to what it is. I mean, for example, the rediscovery and taking seriously the music of Gershwin had to be a question of people getting rid of a certain received idea of whether it was great or not, because he didn't have the usual credentials, and he did it out of the other thing. But he was studying all his life. He constantly was studying with all kinds of people, and he taught himself extremely well.
Yeah, this credential thing always gets to me, I have to admit, because of course what I tell people is I just don't think Mozart ever got his doctorate, but somehow he managed to write a few good tunes that still kick around a little bit. So what the hell? And Beethoven, I think it's also true of him. I'm not sure he had any credentials. We studied with Haydn, but I'm not sure Haydn ever gave him a diploma.
Oh no! I mean, but the post-war situation in America actually was starting a little bit during the Depression, that universities were beginning to use schools of music, which were essentially first because of the music education. That's what they thought would bring in the money. And they were used, in those days, music education was taught in the Department of Education. When the schools throughout the United States began to incorporate music schools, and not just for music education majors, but also the rest of it that goes with it, that's pretty much of an effect of about this, I'd say, at the end of the Second World War is when that really became pretty much all over the place. And that was somebody who had the whole idea is, oh my gosh, composers can be, not it would be like a kind of wonderful Greek kind of like a Periclean age of composing, which of course Pericles is only about the lifetime of Pericles. We always forget that. But the main thing is, exactly. But we had this notion of, this is a nice, safe place where composers would have to worry about making money because you could teach and you're there and you got a nice job and you got and health insurance and, you can buy a house and all that goes with it. So, but with it comes the fact that people could suddenly feel, oh, well, I'm a university composer. I'm a responsible person in the world and so on. And with that would come a sense of probably, hey, we are of a higher level and of elite, and we can sort of look down at others because look at us, we're university composers, and that's, I always hated that. I was never for any of that, and I couldn't be really.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Hey, we've got a few questions, and these are really good questions, so I thank you, your questioners. Here you go. For anybody who wants to chime in, do you think there's any modern movement similarly viewed as a threat by present-day institutions?
Well, I can speak to that.
Okay.
And I know when Steve Reich and Philip Glass, Lamont Young, Terry Riley, when they were first starting to be recognized, I think there was a lot of opposition by university composition faculties. Here were composers who were forming their own groups and having a certain amount of success, but were pointedly not teaching in universities and like you say, they all had credentials of some sort, but not in a traditional way, and they didn't follow what had become, as Bill has just described, the path after World War II of getting university jobs and teaching from there. So I think the minimalist movement was one of those that did receive a lot of opposition when it first started.
I remember feeling threatened by Steve Reich. I remember going to the first Carnegie Hall concert, which you must have played in, and experiencing that as a threat. I was threatened the first time I heard a piece by Lou Harrison. And why shouldn't I have been threatened? I studied 12-tone composition with Claudio Spies at Swarthmore College. Oh, wow. And the notion that these guys were important composers, whether it was Lou Harrison, that was the suite for cello and harp, which I heard, or the Reich ensemble at Carnegie Hall, this is absolutely threatening. No question about it.
I have to admit, I was intrigued by it all.
Really?
Yeah, good for you. Well, I was intrigued also, but
I'm sorry. When I was at Yale, Philip Glass came up to do a concert, and a solo concert. And of course, it was sponsored by the art department or the art museum, and nobody else came out to listen. So he and I hung out for 3 hours afterwards and just talked a little bit. But I don't know. I thought that and Meredith Monk, this was out of the box stuff. Now I was at Hampshire College, so I guess that also contains a little bit. Do you think rap or any other music right now presents, quote, the same kind of threat that you've just described?
I can tell you that there is today a forbidden composer.
Who's that?
Arthur Farwell. Do you guys know the name Arthur Farwell?
Sure.
So Arthur Farwell, who was the head of the Indianist movement following Dvorak, composed music.
Because of Dvorak's Negro music was important, and all those guys couldn't stand that. So they went to the Wawa and Fest and everything. Go ahead, I'm sorry. I'm just putting that into
context. Go ahead, Joe.
I can tell you from personal experience that if you present today the music of Arthur Farwell, you have to duck and cover because it's considered politically unacceptable, which
Oh,
I very greatly resent. And it's erased, at least temporarily, from our American musical past, a very considerable figure.
why was he so berated then? I mean, I just don't, I've certainly heard music of his and been in concerts where it's done. I hadn't noticed there was such a terrific cabal against him.
Cultural appropriation bill.
Ah, so familiar. Well, it's, people want to have something nice, kind of secure. That's one of the reasons I never could deal with the New York School of composers when I was living there. I was not going to be played up in Macmillan when it was,
Yeah.
no, I just knew that, and it was all right. It was perfectly fine. That's why I also didn't live in the Upper West Side like you did, because I knew that I was never going to fit there.
So
Okay.
that's
Another question for you guys. It's an interesting one, and I'll at least make my one comment to it. And it's, where does Leonard Bernstein fit into all of this?
Everywhere.
At all, since there's another guy who I think you'd say was well, to say a polymath is to not do him justice. To say that he was interested in everything and or eclectic also doesn't do him justice. Yet at the same time, Joe, I know that, I don't know what he thought about Gershwin. I know he recorded it, and I've seen.
he had many things to say about Gershwin.
He did.
He didn't. He took the line that Copeland and Thompson took.
That's what I
Gershwin was
would
not
have
a finished composer. Bernstein is a fascinating study in the question of American identity. He spent his entire life trying to figure out what it meant to be an American classical musician. He approached this question from many different points of view and wound up conducting the Vienna Philharmonic and the symphonies of Beethoven, Brahms, and Schumann. If you look
and Mahler.
Mahler, if you look back at the unanswered question, when he was trying to ask the question, whither music, remember the Norton lecture?
Yeah, sure.
He didn't see what was coming, whatever you want to call it. Steve Reich was coming. John Adams was coming. Lou Harrison was coming. Bill Bolcom was coming. He didn't see that at all. He couldn't figure out what was coming. All he knew is that he wasn't comfortable with 12-tone music and was much more comfortable looking back to Mahler. At the New York Philharmonic, he wound up looking at 20th century romantics.
Mm-hmm.
Gilson, Sibelius, Mahler, of course.
That's the right venue for an orchestra of that particular period. That's the music it should be playing. It's that kind of collegium music. I mean, it's the right appropriate kind of thing. If I were conducting a big orchestra like that, that's what I would do too.
That was fashionable at the time because what he was not conducting was non-tonal music and 12-tone music. He just didn't take to it.
No, that's probably true. How many people has it been taken to anyway after that? I mean, think of, when I think of the way it was absolutely, you were not played in the contemporary music concert if you didn't have at least the smell of total chromatic about you. And that's no longer the truth, but it was certainly.
Yeah, I mean, if we're talking about threats, there was a period when it was very hard to feel that important music was being composed that was tonal.
Well,
there's a bit of a connection. You brought up John Adams. John Adams was a bit of a protege of Leonard Bernstein for a while, I think, as a conducting student. And in the 1970s, the Steve Reich Ensemble played drumming in San Francisco after John Adams had moved there. And up to that point, John Adams had been composing electronic music and fairly conventional at that, Western classical music. But he heard drumming, and that basically changed his whole compositional trajectory after hearing that piece.
He studied with Leon Kirchner, right?
He did, right?
Yes.
At Harvard. Right.
Leon was of a different orientation.
Yeah.
Right.
This is slightly off the topic, but not completely. Is to stick with Bernstein for a minute. Let me ask the three of you, and if you about the Mass, because there's a piece that represents an American eclecticism, Bill, that somewhat, at least tries similarly to Songs of Innocence. So let me start with you. What do you make of the Mass?
I think it's a mess. I don't know what it was, and there are wonderful parts in it, but I think an awful lot of it is just so. Maybe it is so intent with a particular point of view, and he had so much of an agenda that I think the agenda probably choked him a bit. It's one of my least favorite things of his, by long shot.
Yeah, but now people are playing it again. He has some major people who seem to love the piece. I agree with you. I just can't figure it out. What about you?
Wrong schmong. What is it? You know, it's. I remember it was very funny. There was a performance of Mass that was being done at I think it was probably at was it Philharmonic? I think the old, and I remember I really had to pee very badly, and and David Hamilton looked up at me thinking, "Oh my, are you leaving?" Because no, I'm sorry, I had a need. I didn't come back either because I really, frankly, I think what bothered me was not that I'm any kind of a religious person, but the whole idea of throwing down the cross and so on. It sounded somehow extreme, but I think it was so tied with the meaning of it. Maybe now I could see something that I couldn't at that point. What bothered me was the parts that were supposed to be particularly expressive came off to me often as smarmy. That was my problem with it, and I still. Whatever I hear, I feel that.
That's generally my experience, I must confess, with Bernstein, that when he's most serious and earnest,
Yeah, like on the least.
least convincing.
I'll tell Marin to drop it from her repertoire. Marin Alsop. Okay, Russell, do you have anything to say to weigh in on that?
I don't really know the piece well, but I'm curious. Maybe Joe or Bill can tell me why Bernstein, the Jewish composer, decided to write a Mass.
Why do Jewish children celebrate Christmas? Because then they could have presents, and it is probably because it was probably feeling, well, this is started out as a sort of more or less Christian country, and the people were trying to make that nothing but, which is a terrible thing to think about. But it may be that, that's why, Hanukkah Bush was never something. It was a chance for people to not feel. If you were a Jewish child and every neighborhood had all these guys with Christmas trees and having presents, you kind of feel out of it if you don't have a Christmas tree too. And that's what happened. I think it's probably true with Bernstein. He felt it would be more universal if we were to go for maybe the major religious unit and population unit of America, which is essentially Protestant. And that's sort of underneath all of what's the largest part of what we're now battling with the white supremacists. But I mean, there was at one point they were the main thing. They are losing, and
Sure.
they're losing in the numbers and so on, which is why they're not like what they are now. At that particular point, that was the way you were able to maybe bring in more people than if he had done something that was more ethnically connected to his history.
Right. I guess just speaking for the religious connection, Steve Reich had a big change in his whole life after he wrote music for 18 musicians. He went into kind of a fallow period compositionally and began returning to his Jewish roots. And that's when he ended up composing the piece Tehillim, which I think originally we were going to do at this music festival, Daniel.
That's correct.
Yeah, and of course that he wrote The Cave and Different Trains, other pieces that had something to do with his Jewish heritage. And of course now he's an observant Jew.
And I assume he specifically wears his cap instead of a kippah yarmulke. Is that true?
He calls it his urban yarmulke.
That's what
he wears the cap.
That's what I figured.
Yeah.
We have a couple of other questions which I'm going to ask. Hold on just 1 second. Well, first of all, here's an interesting one, because here's a composer who isn't talked about much, but in this whole picture, where does someone like Morton Gould reside? Anybody know his music? Bill, did you learn? I mean,
He was a wonderful composer of what he did, and
yeah,
I always liked him because he what he did extremely well was the kind of very elegant, popular, but extremely well put together piece where it's like the piano piece pavant. My next door neighbor woman, it was a young girl who was studying the piano, and she had these long fingernails. So when she would chuk, 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 you'd hear the fingernails as she played the left hand. So it's one of those things I remember. But it was when I first met him. I think we were doing a symphony space there, and he came back to me, and he said, "Well, I know what you're doing, and I hate you, but thank you for so on." It was a very kind of strange and kind of wonderful way. When he was finally admitted to the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and there he was there in that whole panoply of people, and he said, "I could talk to you. I don't know what to talk to anybody else." So I mean, I felt very comfortable with him. He's certainly of his kind. He's extremely well done. I liked him very much personally, but I think he felt a little bit beleaguered because nobody would take him seriously.
There are a couple of pieces of his that I know and like. One is called Spirituals for String Orchestra. Do you guys know that piece?
Oh,
I don't know that one.
Metropolis played it. And the other is his anthems. Like he has a really beautiful version of America the Beautiful for orchestra.
Mm-hmm.
He was also a very funny guy, wasn't he, Bill? I mean, I remember him as being absolutely hilarious.
Oh yeah, and it was a bit outrageous too. No, I wish I'd known him better. I really
troll. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, I know he felt that he felt he could talk to me. He didn't know what to do with an awful lot of the other composers and intelligentsia.
Yeah.
So
I remember playing some of his music in concert band. I don't know whether he wrote it was originally for concert band or
sure.
he made arrangements, but
I think that
I really enjoyed it.
Is originally a concert band piece, isn't it? The tune.
Which one?
The tune that Bill just sang for us.
Oh.
I think that's
Yeah,
originally.
I think so. It could be, yeah. Yeah, I played quite a bit. I enjoyed playing his music back in the concert band days.
So here's a question that may I'm not sure if it applies to Steve Reich. I don't think so, since his music is mostly tonal. But so audiences don't like to listen to a lot of new music, particularly of the atonal sort. How do we help audiences become better and or more adventurous in what they're willing to listen to? You know, it would be hard to bring a piece of Steve Reich to the Tucson Symphony. The audience would have a hard time dealing with it. Gershwin, they're fine with. Bill, I think they'd be fine with your music. Now, I say that even in this case where Steve Reich's music is on the surface is rather, you'll excuse me, placid in terms of its tonal materials, of its actual pitch materials. But aesthetically, it's quite different. Now, I'd also respond, okay, because most music is bad, and anytime you hear lots of...
I think it should be very easy to present the 5 pieces for orchestra by Arnold Schoenberg. If you were talking about the Schoenberg Piano Concerto, that'd be a different thing. And any conductor who believes in those pieces should be able to interest an audience in them just by telling the audience what's going on. I don't think that's a hard piece to listen to if you're properly disposed to it.
Oh, I agree. No, you'll have no argument.
Right. I'm sure you agree.
Yeah. Well, guys, it's just a little after 4. I'm just going to wrap things up here because Bill's got a phone call. Bill, I want you to know when my first symphony was performed up with the Seattle Symphony in around 1991, Lynn Harrell was the cellist. I think it was with them and not Cincinnati. And in the first movement, for the first 2 minutes, somebody's phone kept ringing.
Oh.
And finally, Lynn Harrell stopped playing and he looked at Jerry and said, "My apologies, I forgot to turn off my phone."
Oh my God.
And they started the performance again. Okay. Okay, look, this has been absolutely wonderful. I thank you, the 3 of you, Joe Horowitz, Russell Hartenberger, William Bolcom. This has been just a delightful.
Well, it's great to see you, Russell. It was a pleasure to meet you.
Great to meet you too, Joe. And Bill, good to see you.
Delightful discussion. Thank you, all of our participants. Remember, we do have an audience who's been here with us, and we thank you for joining us. You now have about an hour before the first concert. And I think you will be able to hear songs of Gershwin and Bolcom and drumming part 1, which we've alluded to in this discussion by Steve Reich. And please join us. And you know, what the hell, send out Twitters and all that other stuff to everybody around the world that you know and say, hey, this is really cool. This is nice. Come and listen in. So everybody, thanks again for joining us. Thanks for our participants. And thank you for our speakers. And have a wonderful afternoon or evening.
Thank you, Dan. Okay.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.